Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, welcome. My name is Kiana and I do a lot of sewing and fashion videos, and today I have a sewing pattern and tutorial on this one shoulder lapel dress. This is a sewing tutorial, but if you're interested in seeing the process of how I patterned and prototyped this dress, I have a YouTube Shorts series that I'm gonna link at the top of the screen and in the description. And that sewing pattern is the first link down below, and as always, I love to reward those who are subscribed with their notification bells turned on, so you can use the code one shoulder to get 30% off this pattern until tomorrow at midnight Eastern time. This of course is a midi length, and it also has some tulle underneath to achieve this extra volume right here. However, the pattern also comes in a mini dress length, and this actually has no tulle included. So you can go with whatever look you want. The tulle is very optional, as is the lapel detail. If you would like to omit that lapel and just have this one shoulder look, you just do not include the lapel. And it would look like this. As always, all the supplies and materials that I use to create this will be in that first link down below in the pattern listing description. And all of the equipment I used in this video will be in this video description. So without further ado, let's just get into the tutorial. All right, so start by printing out your pattern at 100% scale, and then line up those sheets of paper without overlapping or trimming down the paper using those lettered and numbered diamonds, and then tape it together. Make sure you refer to your instruction pamphlet to figure out what size you want to create and cut on that respective line. Now, when cutting out your pattern, you really need to pay attention to those pattern details on each pattern piece, with what fabric you're using to cut it out and what the pattern is. Now, this is an asymmetrical dress, so it's really important to stay organized because the left and right side of this dress is not symmetrical. Now, for the shell fabric, your outer fabric, you are going to cut it with the fabric face up. This is how you should usually be cutting out your patterns. However, for the lining, you want your fabric face up, but this time you need to face your pattern down. The pattern should be face down when you cut it out. This is because since the dress is asymmetrical, the shell and lining should be opposite. This is because when you place the lining and the shell wrong sides together, the right side of the lining will be facing your body and the right side of the shell will be facing away from your body, which means that they have to be constructed opposite. Another important thing to note is that the lining fabric I'm using is the same on both the front and back, which makes it less important to stay organized, though you should still be staying organized. But if your lining fabric has a right side, then you should be closely paying attention. And lastly, for the shell, I'll be using both sides of the fabric as right sides at certain points just for design details. But when I refer to the right side of the fabric, that means the side that is going to be shown. So whatever side of the fabric you want to be on the outside, that is the right side of the fabric. Now, starting with the front dress on the shell, we're going to be sewing the waistline seams first. So place the front skirt yokes right sides together with the front bodice pieces and sew and press those waistline seams open. We're also going to repeat that for the back dress. So place the skirt yokes right sides together with those side bodice pieces and pin. And you're also going to be doing this with the center back skirt panel with the center back bodice as well. And we're just going to pin, sew, and press all of those seams open. Now that we've sewn the waistline seams, we can also sew the princess seams. So place your side dress pieces right sides together with your center dress piece and sew and press those seams open. You're also going to repeat this with the back dress. Now, once you've sewn the front and back dresses, place those two pieces right sides together and pin along the shoulder seam and the side seam that's on the same side as that shoulder seam. We're going to sew these two seams, but we are not going to sew the other side seam seam because that's where we're going to place the zipper. So just sew those 2 seams and then press those seams open. Now you can go ahead and repeat all of those steps with the lining, sewing everything again right sides together. However, remember we cut out that lining opposite to the shell. So once you sew everything right sides together, the lining dress should look opposite to the shell. Now moving on to the shell skirt panels. You're going to take 2 of the 4 panel pieces, place them right sides together along that long straight edge, and then sew, serge, and press that seam. We're going to work with this skirt panel that is sewn together first. Now we're going to insert these skirt panels into the shell. So find where those gathering notches are and then sew 2 rows of basting stitches between those gathering notches in the seam allowance. To gather, you leave your thread tails long, you do not backstitch, you lengthen your stitch all the way, and then when you finish your stitch, you again do not backstitch and leave those thread tails long. This way, you can grab the bobbin threads and start gently tugging on those threads to begin gathering the fabric. To help you figure out how much fabric you need to gather, place the skirt panels right side together with the dress and pin along the areas that do not have any gathers. Do this on both sides and then continue gathering that middle section until it fits into the dress. Once everything is fitting together, double knot your bobbin threads to keep everything in place. Make sure those gathers are even and then pin it in place, and then you are going to sew and serge this seam. It's important to serge the seam because it's not going to be completely hidden by a lining. Now with the 2 shell skirt panels that were not sewn together, you're going to repeat that process of sewing the gathering stitches and then sewing in the skirt panel to the dress on the other side. Now this is the side where the zipper is going to be, so I like to start my gathering stitches about 5/8 of an inch away from that side seam edge so that there's not too much bulk in that side seam when inserting the zipper. Now for the lining, you're going to repeat a similar process of taking 2 of the 4 skirt panels and sewing them right sides together. However, these skirt panels are different. They're not all 4 the same, so it's important to stay organized. So if your fabric is all face up, the piece on the left should be a front skirt piece and the piece on the right should be a back skirt piece, and they should both be face up. Now, take your pieces, place them right sides together, and pin along the straight edge. Then you're going to sew, serge, and press this seam. Now is the point that we can add tulle if you would like to add more volume. The midi length dress that we're sewing right now is going to have tulle, but that midi length black and white striped dress has no tulle in it, and it wasn't necessary for this dress if I wanted volume because that fabric is already so structured. But for this green dress, if I want structure, I'm going to have to add tulle. Now the amount of tulle that you add is completely up to you. For me, I'm gonna take 60-inch wide tulle. The width of the tulle only has to be as long as your skirt piece. My particular fabric is 60 inches wide, and I'm gonna use 5.5 yards for one side of the skirt. Now I'm going to take that 5.5 yards and fold it in half so I have double layered fabric that's 2 3/4 of a yard long. I'm going to gather it at a ratio of 6 because ultimately our goal is to gather the tulle to fit into the section of the skirt lining between those 2 tulle notches. You can gather it with the method I taught you earlier by sewing 2 rows of basting stitches and pulling on those threads to create gathers, or you can use a gathering foot. Once you have your tulle gathered, place it at the wrong side of your skirt lining between those 2 tulle notches and pin it in place. Make your gathers even, and then you're going to stitch the tulle to the skirt panel within the seam allowance. Now you're going to repeat this process for the skirt panels for the other side of the skirt with the half skirt panels, and this time I'm going to have my tulle measurement, so I'm going to use 2 cuts of 2 3/4 yards folded in half and gathered for each side of the skirt panels. When I'm pinning my tulle to the skirt panels here, I'm leaving about 5/8 of an inch between the tulle and the side seam allowance so that it's not too bulky when I insert my invisible zipper. Now you're going to take the skirt panels and place them right sides together to the dress and sew and serge those seams. Now it's time to insert our invisible zipper into the shell dress only. My special trick for inserting my invisible zipper is basting the zipper in first on one side, then zipping it up and using pins to mark the other side of the zipper where the waistline seam is and where the zipper stops. Then I unzip the zipper, flip that side over to the other side of the dress, and use those pins to help the placement of my zipper. Then I baste in this side. I zip up the zipper to make sure that everything is lining up nicely before sewing in my zipper permanently with an invisible zipper foot or a regular zipper foot. Now I'm going to zip the zipper before I trim off the excess zipper about an inch lower than where the zipper is sewn. Then I'm just going to finish up this seam by sewing the seam closed below the zipper. Now moving on to the lapels, and the lapels are completely optional, so if you would like to make your dress without lapels, just completely skip this step. First, we're going to take the collar, place the pieces right sides together, and sew these 3 edges. So you're gonna sew up one edge, pivot your work, sew along that long seam, and then pivot your work and sew down the last edge. Then trim down your seams, clip those corners, and then turn it right side out and give it a good press. Now, if you forget which is the front and back of your collar and your lapels, the back is longer on both the lapel and the collar. So from the center of the collar to the edge, that section is longer on the back side of the collar. Now we're going to take the back lapel first and place those back lapel pieces right sides together with the short unsewn edge of the collar between the lapel. Now you're gonna sew along these 3 edges of the lapel, making sure to not sew the lapel at the neckline. And when you sew the last edge of the lapel, you will also end up sewing the collar into that seam. And this is the only place that you should catch the collar when sewing the lapel. Then trim down your seam allowance, clip those corners, flip everything right side out, and give it a good press. Once you've done the back lapel, you can repeat the exact same process for the front lapel. Now we're ready to baste our lapel collar into the neckline. And if you forget which is the front and the back is the longer lapel. So take your lapel, place it to the right side of the dress. Make sure you place the front of the lapel to the front of the dress, of course. Pin at that shoulder seam where the collar is the smallest, and then pin the edge of the lapel next to the zipper. It shouldn't pin through the zipper, it should pin right next to the zipper. Now there's a possibility that your neckline has stretched out while you've been sewing and manipulating the fabric, so your neckline might be a little longer than the lapel collar, so you're going to have to ease it back in to be the same measurement as the lapel collar. So you're just going to baste the lapel collar to the neckline within the seam allowance. Now you're going to take your lining dress and serge the edges of that side seam all the way down to prepare for it to be sewn to the zipper seam. You're going to place your lining dress right sides together with your shell and pin along the neckline and down the side seam with the zipper open, and the zipper should be sandwiched between the shell and the lining. You're going to start sewing starting at the side seam right above the zipper, sewing the side seam with 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you reach the neckline, switch to 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then once you finish the neckline and you pivot your work to go down the other side of the side seam, you're going to again use 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now just finish the lining side seam below the zipper by sewing that with 1/2 inch seam allowance, right sides together. To finish the neckline and make it crisp, we are going to top stitch the neckline. So when you top stitch the neckline, pull out your lapel and top stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the lapel seam through the shell and lining down the whole neckline. And then optional, you can add a hook and eye on the inside of your dress at the top of that zipper seam. Now to finish the arm's eyes, you're just going to baste the lining and the shell together, so when you sew the bias tape binding on, your fabrics don't move around. This way they can kind of act as one layer of fabric. Now grab your 1/4 inch bias tape and on one end press the edge inwards 1/2 inch. You're going to place this right sides together at the armhole right at the side seam and pin. We are going to sew along that first indent about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge on that bias tape all the way around the arm's eye. When you get to the end, overlap the end to the beginning of the bias tape by about 1/2 inch before backstitching and then clipping off the excess bias tape. Now refold the bias tape in on itself to enclose the seam allowance and give it a good press. Now once you've done that, take the bias tape and fold it inwards towards the lining one additional time and then press all the way around the arm's eye. We don't want any of that bias tape being seen from the front of the dress. And then you're either going to top stitch stitch that down with your sewing machine, or you can sew a hand sewn whip stitch like me, just because I don't want any stitching visible from the outside. And the last step is to hem the dress. If you're using a very loose weave fabric like we are, the side seams are probably going to stretch over time because they're cut on the bias. So a little tip, I like to leave my dress hanging overnight before I hem it, and then either use a hem marker to mark an equidistant length from the ground all the way around the hem, or a ruler and some pins. Now to do a rolled hem, press your hem allowance under 1 inch, so about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. Take your scissors and trim off that seam allowance very, very close to the seam line that you just sewed, and then take the hem, roll it under one more time, press it, and then top stitch that one final time to finish your rolled hem. Do this for both the shell and the lining. Now the last step is just to hem your tool, so use some tailor's chalk or some pins to mark where the tool hits the very end of the lining. Then just grab some scissors or a rotary cutter and cut off the excess tool, and then you are done. All right, so that is how you sew this one shoulder dress. Let me know which dress you liked more, the Christmas inspired midi dress or my Beetlejuice Halloween costume mini dress. Don't forget that you can get 30% off this pattern until tomorrow at midnight Eastern time when you use the code ONESHOULDER. If you like this video, feel free to give me a thumbs up because it's the easiest way to support your favorite creators for free. Also, feel free to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. My handle is Kiana Bonollo. Make sure you're subscribed and have those notification bells turned on so you don't miss out on pattern discounts in the future. And I think that's everything, so I'll see you next time. Bye.